I'm Sarah from Halftone, and today I'll be talking to you guys about rendering and exporting from After Effects for today's Lunch and Learn tutorial. I have this file set up, and right now I just have an MP4 and then a composition that has animations that are native in After Effects, just so that we can talk about rendering in After Effects and how lagging can be not cured but like improved, because if you're working with really heavy MP4s or MOVs or like a lot of effects in After Effects, just scrubbing through the timeline can cause you to lose frames just in this viewport. And so a way that I've worked around that issue is using proxies. And proxies they're like temporary files, and it's like a duplicate of the render from the timeline, and After Effects sources this duplicate file temporarily, and then you get rid of the proxy before you export, so that you end up exporting at full resolution rather than this like low res temporary file you created to improve render time. That was like a lot of jargon. All right, let's just slow down for a second. So when I scrub through really quickly, you can see that the pixels get bigger and it's like going bonkers, and it could definitely be way smoother to view this MP4. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna right click on the asset and go to create proxy. And because it's an MP4, I'm gonna create a movie rather than a still. And then it opens up the render queue in After Effects. And you can see that it says draft settings because it's not like your final file or your final render. It's just to improve render time. And for my proxies, I go to draft settings, and then I set the resolution to 1/3. So it'll be really pixelated when you zoom in really far, but for the purpose of scrubbing through the timeline, it's not really necessary to have super crisp pixels. Yeah, so now we have that set, and then you gotta set your location, and I just have a folder called Proxy. And if you're working in a huge After Effects file and you have like your working files and you're like linking a bunch of different sources for your assets, it's good to have a separate folder for your proxies. I'm gonna slap that in there, and I'm gonna render it. And you can see here that there's now like a little gray square next to the file in the assets window, and that means that your proxy is active. And the scrub time is a lot smoother, and we don't get those huge pixels when we're going really fast. If you're like zooming in way far and you see like all of these, like the resolution is really bad, but you want to look at the scrub time that close up, you can uncheck the proxy, and so it's now referencing the original file, like your original asset, rather than the temporary proxy file. When you're exporting, you gotta make sure that your proxies are unchecked or not enabled, otherwise it will export the low res version of your asset. So you can either uncheck it, or if you want to like be extra sure, you can right click, set proxy to none, and then it unlinks the asset from your temporary proxy file. When we exported the proxy file, it brought us to the render queue, which is After Effects' native exporting options, because otherwise there's this separate Adobe program called Adobe Media Encoder, which I'm sure we're all familiar with by now. The reason why you would choose between the render queue versus Adobe Media Encoder is that you're not supposed, like quote unquote, you're not supposed to export final assets from After Effects, because Media Encoder is like, has way more options, way more presets, and a lot more file types to work with than the render queue. But for the purpose of quickly rendering something for testing, like to see what it looks like and it's not your final file, then the render queue in After Effects works fine. I use the render queue specifically for MOV files because it does export MOV, but so does Adobe Media Encoder. It's just, if you're exporting MOV and you don't want to open up another program or like waste the time doing that, then After Effects exports MOVs pretty okay. And to export an MOV, I'm going to bring up this other composition that I have here. And so I double clicked into that pre-comp. And so now we have this animation composition opened up. And so then now when we export, because we have this tab up, it'll only export this pre-comp. It won't export what we have going on over here. Like it won't export this MP4 because it's not in this composition. So for the render queue, you can access it from File, Export, Add to Render Queue, or you can do Composition, Add to Render Queue. I always end up going through Export, but this is way faster, and there's a key command for it, which is nice. Lossless means that it'll export as a QuickTime MOV, and you can see that they have like quick little presets. This composition that I have right now, it doesn't have a background. I have no solid color background. This one is hidden, so it's transparent. And so if I wanted to export a transparent MOV, because you can't export transparent MP4s, you can only export transparent MOVs, I would do lossless with alpha as the preset. But if you're like, I want to know how to do that on my own, I don't need a preset for that, you click into the output module, and then here it usually has it set to RGB. You gotta set it to RGB plus alpha, and then go to format options. And then in format options, you can access the codec. And then you go to alpha ProRes 4444. And then you hit OK. So you gotta make sure that it's set to this option, and then you're good to go. But again, there's a preset for that. And then you select the location. I'm just going to slap it onto my desktop, and then render. Sick. Let's say that we want to export an MP4, which is usually a smaller file type, and it doesn't have a transparent background option. But to show you that, we're just going to go to add to Adobe Media Encoder without the background enabled. So here we are in Adobe Media Encoder. Usually it takes way longer to load, but I already had it open because I'm prepared. And so MP4s are not MPEG-4s, they are H.264. So you got to have this selected for the MP4. And then Adobe Media Encoder automatically matches the bitrate to whatever the source file is. But I don't usually fiddle around with this chaos. I just stick to the defaults. And then you gotta select the location. And another thing about Media Encoder is that a lot of times you're like, how do I make a GIF? Don't I have to bring that MP4 or MOV into Photoshop and then export a GIF that way? Well, actually, Media Encoder lets you export multiple file types from the same composition. So I just added another export option by clicking Add Output there, and then Animated GIF is an option in Media Encoder. To actually export, you gotta hit that little Start Queue button, and then it goes through those two files, and then you can see them where they landed, looking spectacular. We're gonna take a look at the MP4 and the MOVs. So we're gonna take a look at those in Premiere Pro so that you can see that this is the lossless with alpha. So the MOV, the transparent MOV from the render queue is looking spicy. And then this one is the one that uses the 4444 Alpha ProRes, and they look the same. So, and then the MP4 does not have a background, so it just automatically puts in a solid black background. That's the basics of exporting from After Effects and how to render faster in After Effects. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed.